Alara could taste the dust before she saw it. A fine grit that coated her tongue, her teeth, settling deep into the crevices of her parched throat. It was the taste of this land, relentless and unforgiving, much like the men who strode through the sun-baked square, their boots kicking up miniature cyclones of despair. She was bound, not by rope, but by circumstance, by the glint in the eye of the man who owned her for this hour, by the hushed whispers that followed her like vultures scenting carrion. Her wrists, raw from the hemp that had held them for days, ached with a dull, persistent throb. The sun beat down, a malevolent eye in the vast, indifferent sky, pressing her further into the rough-hewn bench where she sat, displayed. Its heat permeated her thin dress, making her skin prickle with discomfort. Her gaze, devoid of hope, drifted past the gawking faces, past the cheap trinkets on display, past the shimmering heat haze that distorted the distant mountains. She saw only the dust, endlessly everywhere. It clung to her tattered dress, an unwelcome shroud. It coated her hair, once a deep, vibrant auburn, now dull and brittle. It permeated her very being, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen since the day the fever had stolen her family, leaving her an orphan, then a burden, then a commodity. The memories of the green valleys, the gentle murmur of the creek behind their small cabin, felt like a dream from another life, a cruel phantom limb she still yearned for. She tried to conjure her mother's face, her father's laugh, but the sun blurred the edges, and the hunger gnawed at the edges of her consciousness, reducing everything to the primal ache of survival. A voice, coarse and amplified by the silence of the market, cut through her reverie. $9 for this one. Strong enough for work, quiet enough not to complain. Who'll start the bidding? The words were flat, devoid of emotion, as if describing a sack of potatoes. Alara flinched, not from surprise, but from the stark, brutal reality of her situation. $9. Less than a good horse, less than a sturdy plow. Her worth was quantified, laid bare for all to see. A wave of nausea, half from hunger, half from humiliation, threatened to overwhelm her. She closed her eyes, wishing for the earth to swallow her whole, to become one with the dust. When she opened them again, a man stood before the small cluster of onlookers, his shadow falling across her like a pall. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face etched by sun and hardship. His clothes were plain, practical, but his eyes, when they met hers, were bloodshot, clouded by liquor, yet held a strange, unsettling intensity. He wasn't looking at her as a buyer might assess livestock. There was something else, a distant, haunted quality, a weariness that mirrored her own, though born of different suffering. He swayed slightly, a heavy flask clutched in one hand. The air around him smelled of stale whiskey and dried sweat. He looked like a man who had lost his way, or perhaps simply given up on finding it. $9, he slurred, his voice a gravelly rumble that seemed to absorb the sounds of the bustling market. There was no negotiation, no hesitation, just the pronouncement like a final decree. The man who owned her, a thin, ferret-faced fellow named Silas, looked startled, then quickly moved forward, a glint of greed in his eyes. He hadn't expected the first offer to be the asking price. Alara watched, numb, as the transaction unfolded. A few worn bills exchanged hands, her fate sealed with the crinkle of paper. The rancher, for that was what Silas called him, swayed back, his gaze still fixed on her, unwavering, unreadable. The silence that followed his purchase was heavier than the dust, thicker than the oppressive heat. She was his now, a $9 bargain, and the terror, a cold, sharp blade, twisted in her gut, for she knew nothing of this man, nothing of the darkness that surely shadowed his life, nothing of what awaited her beyond this miserable square. The rancher, Caleb, as Silas had called him, did not offer her a hand. He simply turned and lumbered towards a wagon parked at the edge of the square, its paint peeled and faded, its wooden spokes caked with the same omnipresent dust. The air around him seemed to thin, making the heat feel even more oppressive. Alara, Her limbs stiff and protesting, rose unsteadily, her eyes fixed on his broad back. She expected a command, a shove, but none came. He merely waited, a silent, imposing figure, his flask now tucked away, though the smell of whiskey still clung to him. She followed, her bare feet crunching on the loose gravel, each step a testament to her weariness. The wagon was old, its canvas top ripped in places, offering scant protection from the sun. As she neared it, a faint rustling sound emanated from the rear, a muffled groan. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thump. She glanced at Caleb, but his face remained a stoic mask, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he hadn't heard anything. He reached the wagon, retrieved a coil of rope from a storage box, and tossed it to her. "Tie your belongings in," he grunted, his voice rough but not unkind. He indicated a small, worn canvas bag that contained the meager remnants of her life, a faded shawl, a tarnished silver locket, a single wooden comb. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her, and the unexpected instruction, the faint hint of consideration, startled her. She fumbled with the rope, her fingers clumsy from disuse and lack of blood flow. As she secured the bag, she strained her ears, trying to discern the sounds from the back of the wagon. There was definitely someone back there, restless, stirring, perhaps bound. A shiver, despite the heat, traced its way down her spine. Who had he brought with him? Another captive? A relative? The mystery hung heavy in the stifling air, adding another layer to the unnerving strangeness of this man. Caleb climbed onto the driver's seat without another word. Alara hesitated, then followed suit, clambering awkwardly onto the hard bench beside him. The wood was hot beneath her fingers, radiating the day's accumulated heat. He picked up the reins, the leather creaking softly, and with a sharp click of his tongue, urged the two weary horses forward. The wagon jolted, then began to roll, slowly at first, then picking up speed, leaving the dusty square and its curious onlookers behind. The silence between them stretched, thick and tangible. Alara stole glances at him. His profile was rugged, a prominent nose, a strong jawline shadowed by a week's growth of beard. His eyes, though still bloodshot, held a distant, almost melancholic quality when they weren't narrowed against the glare. He drove with a practiced ease, his large hands firm on the reins, guiding the horses over the uneven terrain, each bump a jarring reminder of their precarious journey. She noticed a faded tattoo on his left forearm, a half-obscured symbol she couldn't quite make out. It was a detail, small and insignificant, yet it stood out in the stark landscape of his presence. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet. The air cooled slightly, bringing with it the scent of dry earth and sagebrush. They drove for hours, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves, and the occasional, almost imperceptible rustle from the back. Alara's initial fear began to dissipate, replaced by a weary exhaustion and a growing, unsettling curiosity. This man, Caleb, was not what she had expected. He was drunk, yes, but not violent. He was silent, but not menacing. And the presence of the bound person in the back, an enigma she couldn't dismiss, deepened the strange, unspoken understanding that was slowly forming between them, a fragile bridge built of necessity and shared solitude in the vast, indifferent wilderness. As twilight deepened into a velvety blue, a faint light shimmered on the horizon. Caleb grunted, a sound that seemed to acknowledge their destination. The light grew, resolving into the solitary flicker of a lantern, marking a small, ramshackle cabin nestled against a low rise. Smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney, a comforting sign of life in the immense stillness. Alara felt a tremor of apprehension mixed with a strange, hesitant relief. This was it. Her new prison, her new life. The wagon rolled to a halt near a weathered porch. Caleb dismounted with a practiced fluidity that belied his earlier drunken stupor. He moved towards the back of the wagon, and Alara watched, a knot tightening in her stomach. This was the moment, the reveal. He reached into the shadowed interior, and the rustling sounds intensified, followed by a low, desperate moan. Her breath hitched. Caleb knelt, untying a series of ropes. The canvas cover was pulled back, revealing a figure huddled in the dimness. It was a woman, her hair disheveled, her face streaked with dirt, a gag cinched tightly around her mouth, and her wrists bound behind her. Her eyes, wide with terror and exhaustion, darted around, catching the last of the fading light. Alara's gaze snapped to Caleb, then back to the woman. There was something about her, a familiarity that clawed at the edges of Alara's memory, a curve of the cheek, a certain set to the jaw. But it couldn't be. Not here. Not like this. Caleb reached for the gag, his large fingers fumbling slightly, his earlier indifference suddenly replaced by a strange urgency. As he pulled it away, the woman gasped, a raw, ragged sound, and then spoke, her voice hoarse, broken. "Caleb, what in God's name?" The world tilted on its axis for Alara. That voice. It wasn't just familiar. It was deeply, intimately known. Her older sister, Martha. Martha, who had disappeared from their lives years ago, swept away by a man of means, a man who promised her a better life, far from their struggling farm. Martha, who Alara had believed was dead, lost to the vastness of the frontier, or perhaps living a life of comfort she could only dream of. Caleb froze, his hand still poised near Martha's face. The name, Caleb, hung in the air, a devastating echo. He turned slowly, his eyes, no longer clouded by drink, now wide with a dawning, horrifying realization. He looked from Martha's tear-streaked face, raw and accusing, to Alara's shocked one, then back to Martha, who was now scrambling to untie her wrists, her eyes blazing with fury and pain, a silent condemnation. "Martha," Alara whispered, the name a fragile, disbelieving sound torn from her throat. Martha's head snapped up, her gaze locking onto Alara. Recognition, slow and agonizing, dawned in her eyes, replacing the terror with a profound, almost primal shock. "Alara? Is that truly you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief. Caleb stumbled back, his face draining of color. The flask, which he had pulled out again, slipped from his grasp and hit the ground with a dull thud, the contents spilling into the dust, dark like blood. "No," he choked out, his voice hoarse, ragged. "No, this isn't right. You were lost. Martha, I thought you were gone." He looked utterly undone. The harsh lines of his face suddenly softened by an anguish that was raw and genuine. The drunk rancher who had bought Alara for $9 was now confronting the wife he had, in a drunken stupor, unknowingly captured and brought home, believing her to be a stranger. The silence that followed Martha's strained release from her bonds was heavy, broken only by her ragged breathing and Caleb's pained, disbelieving murmurs. The horror of the situation, the grotesque irony, settled over the desolate ranch like a shroud. The full moon, a luminous disk in the indigo sky, cast long, spectral shadows across the cabin. Inside, the lantern flickered, illuminating a tableau of stunned disbelief. Martha, her wrists rubbed raw, huddled on a rickety chair, trembling, her eyes still wide with the ordeal and the shock of seeing Alara. Caleb, sobered to a degree that was almost painful to witness, sat slumped on the floor, his head in his hands, uttering muffled apologies and fragmented explanations. He had found Martha wandering disoriented on a remote trail, her memory fragmented by a blow to the head, a victim of bandits who had left her for dead, stripped of everything. In his drunken confusion, he hadn't recognized her, mistook her for a vagrant, a lost soul, and in a misguided attempt to help or simply fulfill a twisted sense of obligation, he had bound her, intending to bring her back to civilization, somehow. The irony was a cruel, bitter twist. Alara, after the initial shock had receded, found herself to be the calmest presence in the room. The years of hardship, the relentless grind of survival, had forged a core of steel within her. She moved with purpose, fetching water, heating it over the small, crackling fire in the hearth. She cleaned Martha's face, gently tended to her chafed wrists, her touch feather-light, almost reverent. Martha watched her, tears silently tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Alara," she whispered, her voice still weak, "you've grown so strong." The night passed in a blur of quiet ministrations and fractured explanations. Caleb, tormented by his own actions and the horror of what he had done to his wife, offered to take them both to the nearest town, to set them free to vanish from their lives. But Alara shook her head. "No," she said, her voice steady. "Where would we go? To what? We have nothing left. And Martha needs to heal." Her gaze met Martha's, a silent promise exchanged. Then she looked at Caleb. His eyes, though still haunted, held a flicker of something she recognized from their silent journey. A deep, profound weariness, but also a quiet sense of responsibility. The days that followed were difficult. Martha slowly regained her strength, both physical and mental, her memory returning in painful, fragmented pieces. Caleb, racked with guilt, worked tirelessly, chopping wood, tending to the small garden plot, his movements efficient, his silence a heavy cloak. He drank no more. Alara, in turn, began to transform the cabin. She cleaned, she mended, she cooked the meager provisions, her hands skilled and purposeful. She had been bought as property, but she moved like a mistress, her inherent dignity shining through the worn fabric of her dress. A strange rhythm settled upon the small homestead. Alara, the bought girl, became the anchor, the quiet force that held them together. She spoke little, but her actions spoke volumes. She taught Martha how to tend the meager patch of corn, how to mend a fence. She observed Caleb, the way his hands, once stained with whiskey, now worked with a steady rhythm, rebuilding not just the physical structures but, in his own way, himself. One evening, as the last rays of sun painted the horizon in fiery hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers, Caleb found Alara mending a torn blanket by the dying light of the fire. "Alara," he said, his voice hesitant, I don't know how to thank you for everything." She looked up, her eyes holding a depth that belied her youth. "We are bound by more than rope now, Caleb," she said, her voice soft but firm. "By what we have lost and what we must rebuild." It was not forgiveness she offered, not yet, but a practical acceptance, a recognition of their intertwined fates. Martha, resting on the cot, watched them, a faint, fragile smile on her lips. The ranch, once a place of drunken despair, was slowly, painstakingly, becoming a home. Not perfect, not free from the echoes of past pain, but resilient, a testament to quiet strength, to the unexpected connections forged in the crucible of hardship, and to the indomitable spirit that could, even from the dust, compel life to bloom.